Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's members event, Social Justice as a Theme in Jewish Art, with Hannah Shaw, our own Hannah Shaw, curatorial assistant at the Zimmerli Art Museum, and Dr. Margaret Olin, senior research scholar at the Yale Divinity School. There are several interesting intersecting areas of focus in tonight's presentation. The conversation will include a discussion around the subject of social justice as a theme for Jewish artists, and we will also give you a preview of an exhibition that will be on view when we reopen to the public in September of 2021. The exhibition celebrates a wonderful new acquisition of 4 monumental paintings by the artist Sheba Sharrow. I want to thank Maida Sharrow for her generous donation of these beautiful and moving paintings. And I also want to thank Mark Roderick, who is a member of our advisory board at the Zimmerli Art Museum. I want to thank Mark for introducing me to Maida. Mark is another enthusiastic supporter of Sheba Sharrow's work. So we'll begin tonight's event with a conversation between our speakers, followed by a preview of our upcoming exhibition. We will save time for questions at the end, so please feel free to send questions through the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Janine will be here to moderate the questions for our speakers. This event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube account. And before I introduce Hannah, I do want to thank all of you for being here tonight. We miss seeing our members, and we look forward to having you back with us in the museum. Thanks as always to Janine D'August and Whitney Prendergast for putting together so many wonderful virtual members events this year. I believe they are working on events for July and August, so keep an eye out for future announcements. So let's begin. I'm delighted to introduce Hannah Shaw, who is a PhD candidate specializing in the history of photography. Her dissertation, August Sonder and the Photographic Conditions of Nazi-Era Germany, considers how Weimar-era photographers and photographic strategies were integrated into the visual culture of National Socialism. Her doctoral research has been supported by the German Academic Exchange Service, the Getty Library Foundation, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Hannah has contributed to the Museum of Modern Art's August Sonder project, and her 2019 article, The Trouble with the Censorship of August Sonder's Antlitz der Zeit, received an honorable mention in the Emerging Scholars Essay Prize, sponsored by historians of German, Scandinavian, and Central European art. As the graduate curatorial assistant at the Zimmerli, she has curated and co-curated a number of exhibitions, including It's Just a Job, Bill Owens and Stud Terkel on Working in 1970s America, and Tiananmen Square, 1989, photographs by Kian He. And now I will turn the podium over to Hannah.
Hi, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Donna, and to everyone at the Zimmerli that made this event possible, especially Janine. It is my great honor to introduce my partner in conversation for this evening, Dr. Margaret Olin. Dr. Olin is senior researcher at Yale Divinity School and has joint appointments in the Yale departments of Religious Studies, Jewish Studies, and History of Art. She is the author of 3 books, 2 edited volumes, and countless articles. Her first book, Forms of Representation in Alois Riegel's Theory of Art, considers the origins of art history and theory as it emerged in turn-of-the-century Vienna. Dr. Olin's work on Jewish art and visual culture has been critical in defining the field. Her second book, The Nation Without Art, Examining Modern Discourses in Jewish Art, laid bare the prejudices and assumptions that have categorically discounted the existence of Jewish art, and thus served to block its meaningful study. As a co-editor of Images, a journal of Jewish art and visual culture, she has continued to upend this misconception by fostering scholarship on Jewish art from antiquity to the present. In 2012, she curated the exhibition Shaping Community, Politics, and Poetics of the Erev that considered the delineation of Jewish and ritual and communal space. Dr. Olin has also contributed significantly to the field of photography as a scholar and a photographer. Her third book, Touching Photographs, examines the emotional and social impact of the medium's display and circulation. In 2020, she co-edited the volume Photography and Imagination, which offers a new perspective on the medium, often tasked with documenting and reporting on reality. Dr. Olin's photography practice has long been intertwined with her personal commitment to social justice. Her photographs of Chicago's first gay liberation rally in 1970, taken while she was still a student, have provided valuable insight to historians and curators examining the city's gay rights struggle. Her current work, which focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was most recently featured in the exhibition, Can Rocks Feel Pain? The Bitter Landscapes of Palestine. Thank you so much for being here this evening, Dr. Olin, and lending your many expertise to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that embarrassing introduction. And I really do look forward to seeing the exhibition of Sheba Sharrow's work in the fall when it appears. You have already taught me a good deal about her.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm going to learn more today. Also, thanks very much to Janine for organizing all of this, and to Donna, and to Whitney, who's going to help us through the evening as well. I very much appreciate this opportunity. And I'm going to share my screen.
Yeah, okay, great.
That's all right.
Yeah, okay, as you do that, then I want to pose my first question for the evening, which is sort of almost a question of definition. So we've called this event this evening Social Justice as a Theme in Jewish Art. And I thought that we could begin by talking about this term, Jewish art, and sort of different ways we can think about it, what it's meant to you, how we can understand the term Jewish art.
Well, Jewish art has had to battle the fact that you might say that the common assumption about Jewish art was that, until recently, it didn't exist. That Jews don't actually make art because they can't. They're not allowed to. They have a commandment that tells them that they cannot make any graven images. Well, that never was true, and I'm just putting out there two books of a number of books that decided to look at this thing from a scholarly, this problem from a scholarly angle. Common, Bland, and mine, and they're both from 20 years ago. They came out about the same time, and I think the cover of my book tries to do away with the problem of not being able to make images. If you can make a representation of someone smashing an idol, you can make an image of anything except for the divine. So the book began by looking at this anti-Semitic origin of the idea that Jews couldn't make art, which begins really in the late 18th and 19th century. It was a nationalist thing. The art was thought to be the expression of the spirit of a people, and how can you have, German art, reasoned the anti-Semites, if you have people like with names like Max Liebermann contributing to it? Max Liebermann was as Jewish as anyone else. His family had been there in Berlin for generations. But somehow you had to identify German art as something that didn't include him. Of course, there was a dilemma. Once you decided that this guy didn't do German art, what was he? What did he do? What this work, the net menders, supposed to be, if it's not German art? Well, you could call it an imitation of German art. Of course, you have a problem then that the German art by a German artist on the right-hand side was also called an imitation at the time of French art. So this was really the more sensible recourse, to go to rootless cosmopolitan art. But it was far better to simply say that Jews didn't make art at all and do away with the problem. The rest of my book tried to deal with what Jewish thinkers and artists who tried to combat the notion that Jews didn't have art, how they tried to combat it, concepts they came up with, which means also a concept of what Jewish art was. So we have Jewish art. Okay, there he is. Now he's a Jewish artist. But what is that? Was it art that's just made by Jews? It's kind of like a Jewish art, his art that has a Jewish mother, a Jewish father, in this case. Well, perhaps it is. After all, we have Jewish baseball players, and we're very proud of our Jewish baseball players. So why not Jewish artists? Doesn't that solve the problem? Now, I didn't talk about baseball in my book, but my critics did, which is why I even bring it up. And not only did my critics talk about baseball, but Common Bland's critics. Common Bland was the one who decided Jews were not, who explained why Jews were not forbidden from making art. So you bring it up, but they actually brought up a point, these critics. They said, well, look, so we have Jewish baseball players, but is what they play Jewish baseball? Well, no, not really. So we have to look to something else to talk about what Jewish art is. The clearest thing is simply to say, well, it's art that deals with Jewish religious subjects, like Ben Shon's Psalm 133. Is a perfect example of Jewish art. Now, I don't actually like the phrase Jewish art at all because it's so easy to slip into nationalism. It's so easy simply to say that Jewish art is something that reveals the secret spirit of the Jews, and that's the kind of thing that makes me personally nervous. I like to think of it as more like a speaking position. You're speaking or making art from your experience. And if that experience includes being Jewish, then we might be able to talk about art's relationship to Judaism or to Jewish ethnicity either. So in discussing the relationship between social justice and art that has something to do with Judaism, I'm going to start with something that Jeffrey Chandler, who was threatening to be in this audience, wrote in the journal that I co-edit, Images. There was an exhibition at the Whitney last year, La Vida Americana. It studied the impact of Mexican painters on American artists, and the inspiration that this Mexican art gave them to use their art to protest economic, social, and racial injustice. So the way that he got involved in this is when he noticed in this exhibition that in this mural by Diego Rivera, which was a representation of which had pride of place in the exhibition, he could see that the banner is translated here into Yiddish. Now, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but
yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, that's where it is. That's Yiddish in there. Kind of hard to see, but it's there. Um, and so it shows even a kind of position of Jews right in the middle of all of this. Also, Jeffrey noted that the curators didn't find it worth commenting on that nearly half of the artists in the show, the ones that were supposed to be inspired by the Mexican muralists, that they were Jewish. And that was a result of the socialist heritage of the immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe and of their offspring. Think of the Arbeiter Ring, the workman's circle, which was founded in 1900 and was a very important institution in New York. The mural itself, by the way, was so left-wing that it was destroyed it simply wasn't allowed to stay in the Rockefeller Center. It was destroyed. Rivera repainted it a year later in Mexico City. Yiddish and all.
Yeah, I think that that's a really amazing part of it too, that the Yiddish travels from the US context back to the Mexican context, that it has sort of an important place within this mural. It's very fascinating, because before you told me about this, I had no idea that there was Yiddish on this mural that I've seen many times.
Yeah, and I've seen this in Mexico City. I didn't notice. But once you notice, it kind of leaps out at you. One of the artists working on that mural on the mural in Rockefeller Center was Ben Shahn, who's one of the artists in the show. Ben Shahn is exactly an example of exactly what, as I said, Jeffrey Chandler was talking about. He was born in Lithuania. His father had been exiled for revolutionary activities to Siberia. They somehow managed all to get back together and immigrate to the United States. Ben Shahn carried on with socialist ideas. Tom Mooney was a unjustly, presumably, imprisoned labor leader, and the reason that Ben Shahn was working with Rivera was because Rivera noticed Ben Shahn for this work, for the set of paintings that he did in support of Tom Mooney, and that's why he asked him to work with him. So the influence maybe didn't just go one way, who knows. So that's social justice. It doesn't necessarily say how social justice social justice and Jewish art are completely related to each other, but it does show some suggestion of why there were a number of Jews working on issues like that. This continued. Both the Jewish involvement in social justice and also we'll see in art and social justice. You might note that in the 1960s, a moment of real social unrest, there were artists. If you look at the Chicago 7, some of you might have seen the movie, and some of you may remember, who are old enough, may actually remember the Chicago 7 themselves. 3 of the 7 were Jewish. Counting every other one from the left, you see Lee Weiner, Abby Hoffman, and Jerry Rubin. Rubin and Weiner actually met in Jerusalem, where they both traveled to study at Hebrew University. And younger artists were also involved in social justice issues. some of them were among Sheba Sharrow's classmates at the School of the Art Institute. For example, Lian Golub, this is one of his Vietnam works. His wife, Nancy Sparrow, also anti-Vietnam work. Many of these young artists had been affected by the Second World War, by the Holocaust, and this kind of the sort of underlying racism of the Holocaust came into their work against Vietnam. Also, in the 1960s, you have, and the 70s, you have some work that does relate to the Holocaust, certainly a Jewish theme, that was that also exists in a kind of wider social justice mode, like some of the other art that I've just been talking about. Here is, for example, an Italian memorial at Auschwitz that a group of artists participated in. And if you look at my title on there, you'll notice that Primo Levi, who will come up later, Hannah will be talking about later, also was involved with. This memorial was actually, if you read Levi's text, which I'm not going to read, but you can see it even in the pictures, I think it was primarily a memorial that interprets Nazism as an outgrowth of capitalism. It was a socialist memorial. And many of the deportees, the Italian deportees, were socialists, including Levi and the other people that worked, the architect and painters that worked on the memorial. You'll see the names of all the industrialists there, the industrial companies that worked with Hitler, with the Nazis, and the Holocaust on that left-hand side. So now I'm going to sort of make the move to looking at the way religion gets into the mix here, if that's okay, Hannah.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. That's one of my questions, sort of where within Judaism does this sort of social justice strain come in, or is it, question is it tikkun olam, this idea of healing the world, or is it more sort of, more fundamental than that? Be curious to hear about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think tikkun olam is a way of looking at it as, looking at social justice as something fundamentally Jewish. Mm-hmm. But it's not completely obvious to me that it was always looked at that way. I think it's almost, sometimes I think that, maybe instead of thinking about how religion, how social justice became part of Jewish religion, might think of how Jewish religion became part of social justice movements. And then how there was an effort after that to make social justice something that was the overridingly Jewish religion, that was part and parcel of Jewish religion at its very essence. So you have, in the 1960s, you also have the famous picture of Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders in Selma, making, and writing to show how he regarded his religion as really prompting him to do that, to a combination of the religion, but also the experiences of the Jews in the Holocaust, Jews having suffered in the Holocaust and elsewhere. Before that, in the in the Spanish Inquisition, in the expulsion, from the Babylonian exile, you name it. Jews have always, we were slaves in Egypt. That's a kind of genealogy that's being imagined here.
Do you think that genealogy would have been imagined without this precedent of the Holocaust? I mean, obviously, Heschel also escaped, like narrowly, essentially escaped the Holocaust himself, and much of his family was killed. So do you think that, the Holocaust becomes this instigating event, this cataclysmic event that then kind of excavates that larger history of sort of subjugation in religious thinking?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of ways to look at the Holocaust. And the couple of ways that the Holocaust has been regarded within Judaism. And one of them is precisely that way. I mean, the other way to look at it is that, therefore, because of the Holocaust, Jews really have to beware of everybody, and they have to have their own place to retreat to, and they have to make sure that nobody else bothers them there. It can be a real tribal thing, the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. We have to separate, we have to leave Europe, we can't assimilate with our neighbors. Those are also lessons one could draw from the Holocaust. Getting, into back into Chicago and its milieu, I'm bringing up Rabbi Arnold Wolf, who was a kind of important social justice rabbi of the 60s. He was a rabbi out in a northern suburb. He invited Martin Luther King to come speak there. He invited the Chicago Seven to come speak there. He befriended Abby Hoffman. He also went to Selma, marched in the South with King. He was a friend of James Baldwin. And he was an important, kind of inspiration for young, socially, oriented Jews. I actually abandoned the synagogue that I was supposed to go to and spent my time at his confirmation class when I was in high school. That's when I first got to know Rabbi Wolf, whom I'm sure Hannah remembers from the south side of Chicago.
I do. And he was also, I think I was reading about him recently, that he was trained also by Heschel, right? Or he had a time of working with him. So
yeah, Heschel was a big influence on Wolf. But most of these people did like to try to look back to predecessors, at least, for their social justice orientation. Mm-hmm. And I still hear social justice rabbis quoting Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a mid-19th century German rabbi who used Torah to argue for social justice and made it definitely part of Judaism, with some interpretations that are still debated now, of course. Lots of people don't agree with either with his interpretation or that's what his interpretation really was. But he's definitely cited by social justice rabbis. And then there are attempts really to bring it directly into social justice, directly into Jewish practice. These Arthur Wascow Haggadahs, a radical Haggadah for Passover in Ramparts magazine, for example, were the beginning of a whole slew of Haggadahs for various causes. And even when you look at you look back at Psalm 133, as well as the Tom Mooney demonstrations, both by Ben Shahn, you realize that the Psalm 133, which is a psalm, behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together. Sometimes that's used as a psalm that shows how wonderful it is when Jews are just together with Jews. But you notice that that Shahn has interpreted it with one black bird and one white bird, and it's very hard not to think that Shahn isn't thinking, in fact, how good it would be if the people of all races could sit down together and be brethren like they should be. So in other words, a social justice interpretation of Psalm 133.
And it seems like a social justice interpretation of Passover and the Passover Seder too, and how should you be approaching the Seder now? Is it only about the struggle of Jews in the past, or is it about sort of a continued commitment that they need to have to these causes?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then of course it's the beginning of a lot of interfaith seders.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the sort of followers, the later, well, maybe some of them not so much later, but again, there's a continued tradition of social justice artists also dealing with religion, with their Jewish religion. Mira Latterman-Ukeles, who was well known in the 70s for her maintenance art, which is in which she washed the floors of museums, or in this case, she's watching the steps to one, trying to elevate menial tasks that were often performed by women, but also just people of lower classes. She also did a series called Mikveh Dreams that were performances around the idea of mikveh, which tried in a sense to elevate, sanctify, or at least gain respect for the idea of for this particular Jewish tradition, in which mostly women immerse themselves to cleanse themselves after their period so that they can have intercourse with their husbands. So she saw these things as related, in a sense, both cleansing rituals. And speaking of cleansing rituals, here's Martha Rossler's part of her House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home series. And again, a late 60s anti-Vietnam War, which has the woman who's cleaning her drapes looking out at the horrible disaster going on in Vietnam. I never thought of Martha Rossler's work as having anything to do with Judaism as a religion, but I eventually realized that every time that she is asked in an interview where her commitment to social justice comes from, she always says, my Jewish upbringing. And she's referring not to the fact that she was in a socialist Jewish household, but to her upbringing in a Jewish day school and what her teachers and the religious people involved with it taught her. So now I go to a bit player. Do you really want me to do this, Hannah?
Well, I mean, I guess maybe before I definitely want you to do that. But before we move on, I just had this idea that I feel like that Martha Rossler example you gave is a really powerful one of sort of this idea of Jewish art as a speaking position and as sort of a way of processing the world that is often, right, not necessarily iconographically shown in the work, but sort of a certain personal commitment or sort of set of values or speaking position that you can kind of uncover later or is often hidden. So I think that that's really interesting. But yes, please tell us about, I do want to hear, and everyone wants to hear about your photographic practice also, starting from this great rally in Chicago.
Yeah, Hannah, first, just one more word about Martha Rossler. I think you're right. And I think that what's interesting is to me is the fact that she herself recognizes that she's speaking from a Jewish speaking position. Not everyone kind of does. Someone else might say, well, that sounds very Jewish of you, but you know, one never thought of it. So yeah, when I first started to study photography after college, I went to graduate school in photography, and I became, shall we say, a bit player in this Jewish social justice artwork. Here, just as an example of the way my interest in social justice defined what I wanted to do, this is a few of a group of pictures that I took of spectators at a gay rights rally in Chicago. It was actually the first gay rights rally in Chicago, 1970, or very early in 1970. The spectators, as you can see, these are the spectators of the marches, weren't so enthusiastic about it. But I had an interest in kind of confronting them, taking the place of the demonstrators so that people could feel like what it felt like to be that kind of pioneer for gay rights.
Yeah, I find that so interesting. Yeah, not just an interest in like showing the event that's happening, but also kind of the social context in which it's playing out, and really seeing both sides, and makes it really a compelling series.
Thanks. And this is just a picture of the rally where you see Lee Weiner, one of those Chicago 7, is speaking, showing solidarity with the gay rights demonstrators. Okay, Hannah already mentioned that my exhibition on the Eruv, which is a Jewish spatial practice, which involves strings and little ribbons or pieces of tape, etc. I started doing that again and started getting more involved in photography as a practice after I came to Yale and became a member of a Jewish studies department. And I went to Jerusalem also to work on this. You can see the ribbon up there in the sky, you know, and if you really look closely, you can see the string that's holding it up too. And somehow after I did this, I felt like I needed to get involved in a Jewish issue that involved social justice in photography. So that's when I started working on I started getting involved as a photographer with an NGO, with an Israeli NGO, which was working against the occupation in on the West Bank. I started a blog. It got more involved. I've done maybe 5 exhibitions on this topic by now, on this and other social justice topics in Palestine. And again, they're about communication or lack of communication, as you can see on the right. They involve words and images. I'm actually not sure whether everyone can actually see all my everything that I have over on the right-hand side of the screen, but I've been working with a partner there, and he provides most of the words, and I provide most of the images. On any given day, there are some times when I do everything or he does everything, but this just gives you a sense of what's involved there. If the army had its way, even the clouds would be prevented from floating over this wadi, it says. Also, it comes into my own religious practice. This is the cover of our family Haggadah in 2019. The goats is in the Jordan Valley, and behind the goat are is a military installation of the occupation army. This is just the cover to a companion book that came out with an exhibition that we held before, until COVID shut it down early in 2020 at Yale University. And we're continuing to work, and we have a contract for a regular book as well. I also have a million of these since it was shut down early. So this is all I brought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's so fascinating. And I mean, I'm curious sort of to hear, and maybe this is something for the discussion section, but sort of how your other work on photography and this idea kind of photography as creating these like social experiences and sort of reorienting communities in touching photographs, how that plays out in your own photographic practice, and specifically in this one, right? What does it mean to take these photographs and exhibit them and have people see them? Is it, I guess I'm curious if that factors into your thinking as well.
It does, and it would be something really interesting to take up if anyone is interested in the Q&A, for example. But I want to hear about Sheba Sharrow.
Okay, so well, maybe we'll do Sheba Sharrow, but I hope we come back to that and think about those questions and think about your work more. Okay, thank you so much. That was really very fascinating conversation, and really couldn't lead more perfectly into this discussion of Sheba Sharrow and the exhibition that currently organizing, that will open in September and run through the July. I'll have thinking very good thoughts about opening in September. I think it seems very possible now. So I really hope that, I'll tell you about the show, and then we can you can visit it when it opens in September. Okay, so this, just want to make sure okay. So this exhibition brings together the work of the artist Sheba Sharrow and the writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi. It focuses specifically on Sharrow's 4-part Dateci series and Levi's poem on which it was based. And the series, as Donna already said, was recently given to the museum through a generous gift by the estate of Sheba Sharrow Living Trust. So this exhibition offers a meditation on history and considers how artists like Sharrow and Levi use their work to combat the sort of reoccurring malignancy of fascism and genocide throughout the world. Sheba Sharrow, pictured here on the left, is known for her visually rich and complex work that spurs viewers to consider politically and emotionally difficult subjects. Raised on Chicago's South Side, Sharrow completed her BFA at the University of Chicago in the late 1940s, and then later moved to Pennsylvania, where she completed her MFA and taught fine art. Sharrow's political commitment was shaped by her experience as a first-generation Jewish American, daughter of immigrants from what is now Ukraine. Like many of the artists we have discussed this evening, Sharrow's Jewish identity was expressed primarily through her commitment to social justice and humanism. So in the middle slide here, Trapeze, we see an example of an existential humanist theme explored in Sharrow's work. And the painting expresses the precarity of life through these two figures, right? This terrified figure here who's being sort of pulled through the air by this figure here who maybe sort of represents death or, mortal danger. And it's hard to tell in this slide, but there's written in pencil here is sort of an ironic phrase from the circus, played at the circus, right? Or this song played at the circus, right? He floats through the air with the greatest of ease. On the right here is Sharrow's From the Files of the KGB. And this painting memorializes the victims of political persecution. Sharrow based the painting on a photograph published in the New York Times of Russian prisoners just before their execution. And this painting also recently entered the Zimmerli's collection, which I'm very happy about. A dedicated reader, Sharrow often incorporated poetry and literary references into her work, as she did in the Dateci series. And so I like this. So this is another example of a work that incorporates a poem, in this case of Pablo Neruda. And I like this photograph of Sharrow because you actually see her holding a book right here. And it gives you a sense of how intertwined her interest in literature and poetry was with her painting. Sharrow's artistic influences included masters of emotional intensity and cutting social commentary, including Goya and the Mexican muralist Jose Clemente Orozco, as well as the expressionists Käthe Kollwitz and Max Beckmann. So just kind of an example of the wide range of historical and more 20th century current artists, or relatively current artists, that she drew from in her practice. As Dr. Olin already mentioned, right, Sharrow was trained at the Art Institute, and as a result, and during this specific moment, that has put her into what is sometimes called the Chicago School, that includes Leon Golub and Nancy Sparrow, who are also artists known for their politically confrontational work, right? So this is a really sort of powerful moment when a lot of artists, sort of an incubator for political engagement in arts, which you see in Sharrow's work and then other artists of that generation. So moving now to the other important figure in this exhibition, Primo Levi. So born to a Jewish family in Turin, Italy, and trained as a chemist, Primo Levi was deported to the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz in 1944. He survived 11 months there before liberation. And when he returned home, a journey that took almost a year, in which he chronicles in his follow-up, in one of his memoir, follow-up to the one I'm just going to describe now. He returns home and he writes two memoirs about his experience. He writes famously the memoir, If This Is a Man, which is published in America under the title Survival in Auschwitz, along with many other works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, right? So This Is a Man and The Truth are sort of the two memoirs that he writes about his experience in Auschwitz and his long journey back home. In his writing, Levi stressed that the Holocaust was a sinister alarm signal, warning what could happen in any society where every stranger was an enemy. And this idea first appears in the preface to If This Is a Man, where he writes, and I'll just read the bold sections, many people, many nations can find themselves holding more or less wittingly that every stranger is an enemy. So long as this conception subsists, the conclusion remains to threaten us. The story of the death camps should be understood by everyone as a sinister alarm signal, end quote. Completed in 1984, near the end of his life, Levi's poem, Dateci, is a visceral expression of this persistent threat. Written from the perspective of a band of murderous fascists, the poem voices their endless appetite for destruction and reveals the toxic combination of delusion and insecurity that drives them. In the Dateci series, Sharrow follows Levi's lead, likewise approaching the Holocaust as a sinister alarm signal, and one that has gone unheeded. Created in 1999 during the Kosovo War, as Europe was experiencing the first reemergence of ethnic cleansing and mass displacement since World War II, Sharrow's series moves from the victims and perpetrators of the Holocaust to the modern soldier. And we'll look at that kind of transition more in just a moment. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, something just to just interject at this point was that I had sort of two questions, I guess, when I started planning this exhibition that I wanted to answer before I felt that I could really sort of proceed, which was, one was to think about how Levi's poem fit into his larger body of work, but also specifically his writing on the Holocaust. And then the second one was to think about why Sheba Sharrow was completing this work or doing this series in 1999, sort of so far into her career, and obviously so long after the Holocaust. And kind of what was it about this moment in 1999 that really spurred her to make her most direct memorial to the Holocaust? So in much of her work, and I think you can see in some of the pieces that I've already shown, that the Holocaust kind of haunts it in the figure of these attenuated, thin figures that you see, right? Certainly, right, in the trapeze. Might as well go back. In this trapeze piece, for example, right, we can sort of recognize this figure here is really evoking the figure of the concentration camp figure, or prisoner, rather. And so the Holocaust, haunts her work in a very stark way, but it's only in 1999 that she decides to make this work that really memorializes and speaks to the Holocaust in this really direct way. So I was really interested in thinking about why 1999, and thinking about, right, why, and also, in the same way, why Primo Levi is writing, in 1984, right, still from this perspective and still thinking through this idea of fascism. So for me, kind of this preface to his first book, If This Is a Man, right, that really sort of states from the very beginning that he's really thinking always about the Holocaust in relationship to what it sort of means for how it could happen again, and how sort of his job as a writer in telling his story is to show people that this is not a foregone conclusion, that this is something in the past. And so, right, we see him coming back to that theme again in this poem, right, sort of making this poem that it speaks to the Holocaust. It could be spoken from a Nazi band, but also speaks to a more general condition of fascism and the threat of fascism. And so I think I can see why Sharrow, right, when she's looking to memorialize the Holocaust in this moment, is looking to Levi's work and looking to this poem that grapples with the same idea of the Holocaust as this sinister alarm signal, right? And thinking about, right, that this series, when we look at it, we can think about it as unfolding from as like sort of the victims of the Holocaust, right? And this is sort of just an example of how Levi's work is really sort of this material presence in the series. Right, so we can think about this work as kind of unfolding from the sort of victims and perpetrators of the Holocaust to the modern soldier. And we can also think about sort of how there is also ambiguity in the figure as well about the time frame that it applies to, right? That there are these markers of the Holocaust, but there's also sort of a slippage into more of a general sense of victimhood or the perpetrator. So in the same way that Levi's poem kind of goes between these two states. So when we look at the series, right, Sharrow she dedicates the first 3 panels of 4 to the victims, right, of the Holocaust. And we can think about that as the Holocaust and also maybe fascism more broadly, or the threat of it, right? And she kind of divides them into these 3 themes, which are capture, defeat, and death, which she represents through the struggles of an anonymous nude male figure. So we'll look more specifically at them now. So part 1 dramatizes the figure's violent capture, right? And we see the figure here, he's hooded and bound, he's lifted off his feet, pulled upwards almost out of the frame, right? So we can imagine that this pole is somehow sort of holding his bound hands and pulling him upwards. Right? So the opening section of Levi's poem, written on the top third of the composition, lists the people and things that the the fascist narrators wish to capture and destroy. And so the poem reads, right, this is the beginning of the poem: give us something to destroy, a Corolla, a silent corner, a boon companion, a magistrate, a telephone booth, a journalist, a renegade, a fan of the opposing team, a lamppost, a man cover. All of these canvases and really Sharrow's work in general are very rich and multi-layered and are full of hidden messages. And in this case, right, we can see the outline of a key here and the words Dateci, right, written in the background there. And also, right, there are many sort of formal elements that she uses to underscore the cyclical nature of the story that she's telling. And one of the strongest is the presence of sort of this red, bloodied foot, right, that appears in the first panel on, in the case of the victim, right, who's being pulled up out of the frame. And then we see it again appear, as we'll see soon, right, in the soldier's bloody boot in the fourth panel. So this idea, kind of the cyclical nature of this experience being formally represented in that way. Right, part 2 shows the defeat of the victim in body and in spirit. And so in this painting, right, the robust, twisting subject of Dateci 1 gives way to an emaciated, broken figure, recognizable as a concentration camp prisoner. And Levi's poem at the center reads, right, give us something to deface, a plaster wall, the Mona Lisa, a mudguard, a tombstone. And then Sharrow, right, she underscores this idea of sort of defacement by shrouding the figure's face in darkness and obscuring his identity. Okay, so the Nazis, so I mean, I guess as I was looking at this series, and I think as the previous quote I included shows, I really it's thinking about how, right, this series is in dialogue, of course, with Levi's poem, but also with the memoir, If This Is a Man, and thinking about how those themes that are so present in that memoir are then conveyed in the series as well. And so the Nazis' systematic assault on the human spirit in Auschwitz is a central theme in If This Is a Man. And it is here that Levi locates the annihilating logic of the concentration camps, which he explains sought to first extinguish the soul of the prisoner and then end his physical existence. In a chilling example, Levi recounts the experience of seeing the spiritually crushed prisoners of Auschwitz leaving for work from his convalescence in the camp hospital. So sort of it's this moment in the book where, because he's injured his foot, he is allowed to be in the camp hospital, and sort of giving him a reprieve and a moment of perspective on camp life that was totally impossible or inaccessible when he was actually sort of part of the general population. So it's this moment where he's in the hospital, and he's watching his fellow prisoners come out in this ritual that happens every morning, where the band plays these like very German tunes and songs, the same songs every day, and the prisoners come out and they march. And so it's this moment where he's looking out at the prisoners and really seeing in this activity the essence of what is so annihilating about this experience. So just reading sort of the bottom part of this section where he talks about sort of that his comrades are their automatons, marching to the music, and he says, right, that the SS men, so the camp guards, are always present for these for the moments where the prisoners come in and come back. And he says, quote, "Who would deny them their right to watch the choreography of their creation, the dance of the dead men, squad after squad, leaving the fog to enter the fog? What more concrete proof of his victory?" Or their victory, right? So this idea of sort of the double death of the camp, and right, we see this in the second part of the series, right, where first you have the capture, and then you have the sort of the breaking or the defacement of the individual, and right, we can think about even Levi's title of of the book, If This Is a Man, right? That's all about this question of what does it mean to be a man, and how do the Nazis sort of take that away from you in the camp? Okay, so part 3 shows the death of the figure who appears limp and drained of color at the center of the composition. And we have here a malign force that we see surrounded in smoke appears above him. And I was really interested to see this study that Maida Sharrow was very kind to share with me. To me, that this study really showed, right, how death was the central theme of this part, because, right, we have a very skeletal figure here, right? There's no ambiguity about the death of this figure in the study. And so, right, we see this gridded form in the background next to the figure, right, is a reference to the crematoria of the concentration camps, where the Nazis incinerated the bodies of their victims and attempted to erase the proof of their genocidal mission. And this reference to the crematoria is then underscored by the smoldering pile of ashes at the bottom of the composition, out of which a flame kind of erupts that seems to try to sort of ignite the pallid hand of the victim. And so, yeah, Levi's lines, the lines of Levi's poem, right, they're sort of seemingly pressed below the psychological weight of the imagery above, speak to irrevocable violation. And the poem reads, "Give us something to rape, a timid girl, a flower bed, ourselves." And we could see how Sharrow sort of systematically shows the poem sort of starting from the top in the middle and ending in the bottom of the canvas, sort of thinking through in these different stages. Okay, so it's in the final part of the series that the perpetrators appear, and we can see, right, specifically, we have a sort of another stark reference to the Nazis and the perpetrators of the Holocaust, right? Specifically in kind of the center of this composition, where you have, right, this figure who's waving the German flag, right? Sort of this sinister sort of look to him, and also this figure who is raising his hand in the Nazi salute with sort of this bloodied palm. And then we see surrounding them are their victims, right? We have a skeletal figure here, and then these two bodies laid out prone below them. So here, Levi's poem reaches a crescendo, and ending with the final section of the poem, which reads, "Don't despise us, we're heralds and prophets. Give us something that burns, offends, cuts, smashes, fouls, and makes us feel we exist. Give us a club or a nagant, give us a syringe or a Suzuki, pity us." It's so sort of coming, ending on the psychological note of the poem. And also, right, she ends with the poem, the end part of the poem, but there's also sort of the beginning of the poem is written out in these ghostly letters behind it, right? So it's really sort of this eruption of the poem again in the final part. So I just wanted to end with a sort of preview of the gallery. So we really sort of designed this exhibition so that Sharrow and Levi could really kind of be talking to one another. So her work will be on the wall, of course, and then also, we're going to have Levi's poem on the wall as well, so they can kind of communicate to one another. And really, we thought that this would work right well to create a space dedicated to this powerful poem and powerful series, to give the viewer an opportunity to really meditate on the important themes and still relevant themes that these two artists brought up in the poem and in the series. So again, right, I hope that everyone maybe can come visit this show when it opens, and would be very curious to hear any comments that you have. So thanks so much. And I know we're over time, of course, but I'd love to open it up now to questions. If anyone has questions for Dr. Olin or I, love to hear them.
Yes, let's, hi everybody, Janine DeAugust here. I'm just going to be fielding some questions. Please feel free to use that Q&A icon right at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so we do have a question. In the picture of the tortured man on the ground, I'm assuming this is Dateci, Hannah. The first line of the poem, give us, the word give on his right side and the word us on his left. There seems to be words hidden in the darkness of his body. And William wants to know if he's reading too much into it, but it might be interesting to go ahead and take another look. These works are so powerful just on a screen, and I'm haven't had the privilege yet of seeing them in person, and I hear that they're of course even more powerful in person. So I'm certainly, you know, looking forward to it, Hannah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, this is a very good question, and I think so. Okay, so first lines. Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very good, I don't think you're reading too much into it. I mean, I think that she's planned these compositions so carefully and thinking about sort of how the figure is in dialogue with the word. So I think that is a very, very good observation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and yeah, I think, I mean, and that's a very helpful thing for me to think about too, right? As I kind of finish working on this exhibition, really thinking more, and I think that that's something that I want to think more about how, yeah, maybe the figures are even interacting with the text. I've thought a lot about sort of where they are in the composition, but how is the figure actually sort of being engaged as well? So I appreciate that question.
Sure. So I'd just like to remind everybody to please use that Q&A, the two little bubbles on the bottom of their screen. I know we have some attendees with hands raised, but typing into that Q&A is definitely the best way. Let's see.
Can I just ask, the person who asked that question got me, you know, kind of looking. It's really hard, obviously, to see on the screen, but is that also some kind of, is that also the crematorium that's kind of in a ghostly way emblazoned on his body, perhaps?
Oh, here. Is that what you're saying?
The grid kind of.
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, is the grid, because it certainly, but the grid, there is this precedent here too, if the grid kind of intersects with this figure and becomes sort of intertwined with his ribs. And so I think that that's certainly, I don't think that can be really a coincidence, and that there's sort of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. And maybe it's also intertwined with this idea of kind of the death of the figure already having happened through the loss of his spirit. I think that's a great point.
So we have some more questions. Hannah, what started your interest in the subject? I know kind of a broader question, but it's from our board member, Mark. So what kind of prompted you to, you know, to really, you know, want to, of course, showcase these works?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it was sort of for the fortuitous gift of this series. And, you know, sort of when they came in, Donna and I were talking about it and just feeling, I mean, obviously they're so beautiful and powerful and important alone, but also in this sort of historical moment. And, you know, when, you know, the sort of political climate in which they came in, right, these seem like very important themes to really make an exhibition only on them, right? It's an exhibition only of 4 works and 1 poem, but we really wanted to sort of take a moment sort of in this climate to think about these themes. And so, yeah, it's a combination of sort of the fortuitousness of this gift and also sort of the relevance of the current moment. And I will also say that I did have a Jewish art and material culture major in college. And so I've been interested in Jewish art and this question of Jewish art and all of sort of these themes that Dr. Olin and I were talking about. And what does it mean to have sort of this perspective? And so all of these questions were activated again by this series. And of course, right, Dr. Olin's book, The Nation Without Art, is so important for thinking about these topics.
Excellent. Wonderful. Dr. Olin, we have a question for you. So one of our members asked that you states that you started this discussion with the question, you know, why no Jewish artists? But can you speak more about Jewish artists before the 19th century?
Well, there were a lot of them. I didn't bring any slides. The one great source to learn about the ones that were just before the 19th century would be Richard I. Cohn's Jewish Icons, which is about religious art in the earlier, Jewish art in the earlier modern period. A lot of it relates to the religion then. There are rabbi portraits, for example. They're the ancestors of the kind of rabbi trading cards that you find in the Hasidic world these days. They're, sort of interesting portraits of, there are also pictures of worship, paintings of worship, and before that, we have left a lot of decorated Haggadahs or illuminated Haggadahs, Haggadahs with pictures in them. And those, at one time, there was always the argument, well, they felt like they needed pictures, so they got some other artists to make them for them. But in fact, a number of Jewish artists have been located in all through Europe. There's also the painted ceilings of the wooden synagogues, and there's the great find that was excavated right before Hitler came in by, among others, and was studied by, at first, among others, German art historians of the Dura Europos synagogue, which is completely covered. It's from the 3rd century, but was accidentally discovered by actually an American and French team in 1932. Kind of renegade German scholars who wanted to do something subversive would teach it in their seminars in the very early period of Hitler's reign. And there are, it goes back, there are earlier painted synagogues and synagogue floors. If you visit the Galilee sometime, that area has the Beit Alpha synagogue, also found, interestingly, in the 20th century. There's, it is in a way remarkable that when the idea becomes contested that Jews don't have art, that all of a sudden all this Jewish art shows up.
Excellent. I think we just have time for maybe one last question. Did Sharrow keep a written record or diary in which she wrote about work during the period? During this period, I know you had mentioned, Hannah, that you were thinking about why 1999. Is there any was there any sort of answer to that specific question?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Maida Sharrow would know better than I do, but I don't think that she did. I mean, I've talked with her a lot, and I haven't heard anything about a journal. I talked about this idea of the Kosovo War with Maida, and she thought that it was very possible reading of this of the work, because her mother was so Sheba Sharrow was so involved with political events and had such a strong political consciousness. So I don't know if she recorded it, but she certainly has sketches of her work, and but I don't know if she has a journal. It's a good question.
Where was this work shown and when? Do you know?
Like the first time it was shown?
Yeah.
I don't know the first time it was shown. That's a good question, but it's certainly been shown in exhibitions since. But are you wondering if it was maybe sort of spurred by an upcoming show or something like that? Yeah, that's a very good question.
Right?
Yeah, no, it's true. That's a good question.
And I know I said it was the last question, that we had time for one more, but there is one more. And I'll just paraphrase because I think it's a great question. I wonder if Hannah and Margaret can speak about how art, even with heavy subjects, of course, leaves us lifted because of the noble goal towards social justice. Is this a dark exhibition or an uplifting show that proves that beauty can triumph?
Well, yeah, that's a great question.
Which I think is, speaks to, of course, how powerful these works are, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that really gets to the heart of Sharrow's practice, is that, she's always engaging in these very emotional, heavy themes, but always with this grace and beauty of almost classical art and the richness of this canvas. So I think that that's absolutely, it is uplifting in this sense of sort of translating these themes into beauty in the way that beauty can really circumvent our defenses often, right? When we see something that's very beautiful, right, we want to look at it, we want to engage in it. It may be a way that we would turn away from the subject matter otherwise. And so I think that beauty plays such an important role, right, in her art and also in this exhibition. And ultimately, I do think it's also uplifting in the sense that to think about things is to have some agency and have some power, and there's something uplifting in sort of being aware of the history and thinking and arming yourself against its sort of recurrence. But yeah, thank you for that question.
I think in order to even have beauty, you have to have something really hideous. It's not only that one uses beauty to try to attract people to face up to these awful events, but also that even beauty is not something you can appreciate nearly as much if there isn't something really fighting against it. The novel always has the conflict in it, the sort of great works are not the little pictures of people being happy and frolicking with absolutely no problem or care in the world. They're often of this kind of friction. And I also think that there's actually nothing so wonderful and, happiness provoking as feeling like one is in the right place doing the right thing. And I think that one of those right places is in the studio doing work like that, and that the audience, the viewer, gets to participate in that as well.
Sort of like a righteousness by proxy kind of
something like that
situation.
Yeah, righteousness. I don't know about that word, but
yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I really love that idea of tension, that you need this tension to have beauty. I think that is really true. And maybe you need it too to have sort of a gravitas, something that's really kind of giving it substance.
Absolutely. Well, we are certainly out of time, but I would like to thank Hannah so much, as well as Dr. Olin being our special guest. I'd like to thank all of you who attended, all of our invited guests and members. And I'd like to drop our Zimmerli at Home website. Of course, everyone knows that is where you'll find information on our virtual events. And like Hannah had mentioned, we are crossing our fingers and hoping to reopen in the fall, and we hope to see all of you there. Dr. Olin, I hope you'll visit so I can meet you in person.
I'll be there.
Excellent. Excellent. Wonderful. And with that, I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you all so much.
And thank you.
Thank you.